All right. Well, good afternoon, Presbytery of Philadelphia and friends of the Presbytery of Philadelphia. As you heard through our banter, or you may have, it is the first time in quite a while that we are going live, gathering at our digital well. This year's approach will be equipping at the well as opposed to conversations at the well. And we're hoping to lean into the gifts of our presbytery as we seek to equip one another in ways that are relevant and faithful to the gospel of Jesus Christ. Today, we are overjoyed that to launch this new model, Greg Klimovitz and Sarah Cooper Seawright, the Reverends Greg Klimovitz and the Reverends Sarah Cooper Seawright will be leading us in what has become I want to say it's not important, it's critical understanding of how the power of story is now expanded to this digital age. And as they've named it, as a means of grace, welcome, and witness. We're glad that you're with us. We're excited about having this conversation and opportunity. And with us, of course, is our esteemed Madam Moderator, the Reverend Ashley Rossi, who will open us formally in prayer. So Ashley, take it away. It's good to be here with you all.
Thanks. As a parishioner said to me this Sunday, it's good to be seen. The Lord be with y'all and with everyone at home. Holy God, no one really tells a story better than you. You've given us the greatest story, a love story that we are called to share with the world. And so we thank you for this time to be together and to think about how we can communicate the love and grace that we've received from you to those who may not be aware of how much you love them and how deeply you desire connection with them. And so open our eyes and our hearts and our minds during this hour that we might think about how we can best tell your story, which is all of our stories, the story of being combined into a holy family, loved and cherished as we are. Bless this time to your use, that we might be servant leaders in this presbytery and beyond. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
So we're going to be kicking out some folks here and sending them out of the space, and it'll be Sarah Cooper Seawright and I having a chance to kind of facilitate this webinar, if you will. So just a brief word of introductions. I'll go ahead and start and just say Reverend Greg Klimovitz here as your associate presbyter, as well as someone who convenes those Presby Speak podcasts that you hear every so often of our presbytery, and get to be a steward of your stories. And in the midst of all things pandemic, it's definitely been a time where I have been tapped to help folks with a lot of this digital platforming that we've talked about over the years, but especially my work with CRC. It's been a joy to talk with our ministries about how to share their narrative. And one of the greatest privileges that I've had over the last few years is working alongside Sarah Cooper Seawright as a moderator there. So Sarah, if you want to introduce who you are too, that'd be great.
Sure. As Greg ably said, I am the moderator of the Commission on Resources and Creative Ministry, and have had the real honor to serve that group for a couple of years now, and have learned a lot about storytelling in that process from Greg. And as we hear your stories as our congregations, and we try to help you find ways to share those out. I'm also a pastor, associate pastor at Swarthmore Presbyterian Church, a congregation, much like many of ours, that's trying to figure out, what does it mean to tell the story of Christ's love, and how we are intersecting with that, and what we are doing in our ministry to share that out. So I'm here not as a total expert, but as one who has had, some experience with CRC, and also, working through this with you. So excited to be here.
Great. Well, before we go any further, I'm just going to say over the screen right now, Kevin, Ashley, and Ruth, if you would like to not have yourselves just on this webinar with the mute signs and all, you can actually go into the participants, and you can actually remove yourself as a panelist and go back in to view this in the other spaces as well. It looks like you have to do that on your own. I can't kick you out. So anyway, hopefully you can see on your screen right now some slides that we're going to be showing up. Sarah, do you see them up there? Are we good?
Yeah, great.
So we're going to talk through a few things, but one of the things that we wanted to do is kind of reach back and talk a little bit about why this conversation matters. I love this stained glass picture here. It's a picture of one of our churches that I was visiting recently, and the windows are propped open. And I remember sitting there as I was in this empty church that hadn't had an inside worship service for quite some time because of the pandemic. And I started thinking about the loneliness of these windows and wondering, like, when was the last time that they were able to share their story, their history with the inside of the congregation? But then I realized that those stories, this window might not have been so lonely after all, as there's been gatherings happening outside those windows for so long. So then I saw the windows were open a little bit, and I just realized that actually the stories that are flowing in and out of these stained glass windows are really powerful. And they didn't stop just because the pandemic hit, but there was new openings, new possibilities for this congregation to share what God was doing. And so in many ways, that's what we're going to be talking about today, is how do we become expansive in our storytelling through these platforms of digital spaces, especially in such a time as this. I'm not going to read this quote, but it's up here on your screen from Brendan Vogt, and a great book that's a little dated now. The Church and New Media Blogging Conference, Online Activists and Bishops Who Tweet. This book is about 12 years old, but it's still pertinent. And the reason why I reached back into this is it was a quote that shaped some of what we did as a presbytery when we started what's called Money Media Mission in 2016. So these conversations are things that we've been talking about for a while. And one of the things that was shared at that gathering was from Reverend Mihi Kim Court, who's a pastor now in Annapolis. She shared at that time that social networks and platforms are varied spaces for holy and sacred becoming. When that was shared with our presbytery in 2016, a lot of us might have been thinking, oh yeah, sure, maybe I'll try this stuff out. I think now there's proof to this statement that sacred becoming has happened in these platforms for real, especially for folks who maybe never thought that they would entertain those as spaces to do worship, to do Bible studies, or to share sacred stories. A big reason why we're having this conversation right now too is because we're co-learners with you. We as a presbytery, we as CRC are constantly thinking through what this looks like to do digital storying in an increasingly virtual world. And so we've learned a lot from our grant recipients as the CRC. We've learned a lot from ministries, some represented in the attendees window here or even on Facebook. We've learned a lot from each of you, but what we've really learned is we have to continue to find ways to move beyond the digital spaces being solely places where we share flat, one-dimensional information, links, sermons, bulletins, to becoming more of that social network, that becoming space where we can collaborate, communicate, connect, and expand our welcome and witness together. We've also learned as a CRC that it's one thing to dream and design creative ministries. It's another thing to set them up for sustainability and ecumenical collaboration. But if we don't tell our stories well, if we don't leverage these sacred platforms as the means of grace that they can be, then our dreaming and our sustainability and our designing can so often be in vain because nobody will hear those stories. Nobody will be able to know what actually is the goodness that's going on in those spaces. So we're looking forward to just sharing a few things that we've learned along the way. That said, I'm going to turn it over to Sarah to talk a little bit about the theology of storying.
Yeah, so when Greg and I were thinking about this and brainstorming what we wanted to do, the first thing that came to my mind is that we are a people of the story. So story is how we engage the gospel witness in our own lives. It's how, speaking personally, the stories that I learned even as a child and then learned how to think about in new ways, as a young adult and then as a seminary student. Those were the things that drew me into this work of ministry. And it is a story that we are telling, as Ashley so helpfully named early on a story of love, a love story, but one that calls us to enter into it at so many different places. And so, we just thought about when Jesus was trying to engage the people around him. There are many different ways, but one way that we come back to again and again is through parable. Jesus told stories. He didn't hand out flyers for events. He didn't post something and said, "Hey, I hope you come." He stood with people, sat with people, ate with people, and he told stories. And those are, most known for us in the parables. And so I was thinking about that. And I'm a big image person. I think images can tell stories in such important ways. And sometimes, as Greg talked about the windows, this is, what you see here on this slide is from one of our favorite artists at SPC, Daniel Bunnell, who this is called The Prodigal Son. And you can see as you look at it, I invite you actually to see or to observe it, and to see how he is telling this particular story, familiar story, that so many of us know through his work here. You see that he's used a recycled bag, and it's the texture to it. He's been able to use that to kind of highlight this embrace in the midst. And on the side, the language of ways to save. There's so much here that, if we wanted to I could spend a lot of time just dissecting the way that Bunnell is trying to evoke this story in our minds and evoke some of the meanings to this story. But I think that this is something that parables are something that we come to and we get something out, we get a new understanding out of every time we come to them, whether they are visual or whether they're spoken. Amy Jill Levine wrote a whole book a couple of years ago, or a number of years ago now, on the parables, called Short Stories by Jesus. And you'll see here, I love the way that what she lifts up is that Jesus parable telling wasn't a way to get across facts or to even try to convince, again, or to just let people know what was happening. Jesus' means of telling stories was to invite people into a conversation, and that her talk about him teaching through stories reminds us of what we already know, but we are resistant to recall. So we're invited not only into the same story, but we're invited to reassess and assess on our own and in community. And our stories help us, how we share our stories, help us think about what kind of invitation are we extending to our community, who that community is. But I think all of this is rooted, as Greg led us into, that we are a people of a story, and that as we are engaging in ministry, we are working to illuminate and invite into that conversation and that story. That's what our work is, and that's how we continue to be drawn in. What we're doing here, we did want to say, is not an invitation to produce more things or more stuff. So we're not trying to get you to add to your list. I would never do that to you because I don't want you to do that to me. What we're doing is helping us think together about what it is that how we share what we're already doing. So what are the ways that we can really dig into that? And so I'll pass it back to you and Greg. I think we'd like to engage you all in some conversation through the chat.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thanks for that, Sarah. It would be helpful. I put a note both on Facebook and on the chat here is, while we won't necessarily get to all the comments that you might drop in the chat window here or on Facebook, we do want to give you at least a space to name it in the chat here for maybe even as we move forward. A response to this kind of question is, what questions do you bring? Really just this blanket open-ended question. What questions do you have related to digital storying of your faith community? What are some of the areas that you're longing to nourish that storytelling? What are the areas that you're facing some significant challenges? What questions might you have? That would be really, really helpful for us as we continue to not only right now incorporate into our conversation, but also as we move forward as a presbytery and as a CRC, as we can see, hey, this is where our folks really are wrestling with digital storying. Great question here. Is are images always necessary for storytelling on a digital platform? I'll at least speak to this briefly, Sarah, if you want to kind of chime in too. I think what you'll see and hear when we talk in a moment is that depends. I think when you think about digital storying and using these social media platforms, there's really no always all universal answer. Context matters for everything. And so for some, images are going to be extremely important. For others, the images could be distracting. That'll be a discernment that you'll want to use related to a team of storytellers that you have in your presbytery. I think one of the things that we've talked a lot about, Sarah and I, is the value of doing storytelling in your congregation and your ministry as a team. Instead of just one individual, finding ways to have collaborators in your community to do that, to help you figure out what would work well and what would matter most. So it might be important to share mostly images. It may not. It really depends.
Yeah, I would. We have a great resource at Swarthmore Pres in our. We have a communications director who is really guiding us in how we think about this, and you know, he is often asking for images. Because I think there is something that an image evokes, but he's also he's really has good wisdom about it. It's not just any image, right? So I agree that there are ways in the various platforms. Some are more heavily reliant on images, and you might be able to tell a story in a certain way on something like Instagram with an image, right? But on Facebook, you're telling a little bit more of a narrative. Is the image as important? I think you have a little bit more space to use your words, and I think the things, so it's interesting to think about even how you're telling the same story across a number of different platforms, and some of those images make sense, and some of those they're not as necessary. And just throwing up an image for the sake of having an image, I don't think is always the most effective thing either. So that is a great question.
And one of the things I learned when as I've been kind of learning on the fly in my ministry here, doing digital editing and videoing and podcasting and whatnot, what I learned early on as I surrounded myself with some folks who were more experienced in this than me, was actually what matters most is not imaging and video quality. It's actually audio quality. And I find that probably would preach, right? What people hear matters so much more than just the imaging in front of them. So they talk about in documentary work and everything in storytelling is that you can have a really terrible image that you're using, but if you have really good quality audio that's overlaid over top that imaging, people still love it. Whereas if you have a really high quality video, but the audio is terrible, people will cut it out. And that makes sense. So I think that's one of the things to just be thinking through is what are you trying to communicate and who do you want to reach? And that's going to affect it. So big time. Well, if there's anything else that comes our way, just throughout the conversation, feel free to put that in the chat or on Facebook. We'll go next. This is something we wanted to we don't want to spend too much time here, but one of the things Sarah and I were talking about quite a bit was how mass media marketing does a really good job in storytelling. We're not here to use corporate stories as a model, as if we're trying to peddle the gospel and sell the gospel. That's not what we're trying to do, is make you really good marketers and sellers of products. But there's a power to story that we can learn from in the advertising world. And so many of these kind of brands, you don't know a whole lot about their product, but they're trying to craft a story that you will find compelling, so that you do more than just buy their product, but you buy their brand. And so they're constantly shaping these narratives, which is really interesting. And I was reading a book recently that was talking about how Harley Davidson makes about 12% of their gross revenue off of apparel. And some of those, and a good portion of that 12% actually don't even own a motorcycle. And that's a tattoo. The amount of folks that they've done in market research who have Harley Davidson tattoos who don't even own a motorcycle is mind-blowing. And the reason why is because folks buy into the narrative of that brand even more so than they buy into the product. Translated for the church, folks, are we sharing a story that's most compelling, or do people know us just because we have a good Sunday school? Right? Like, what is the narrative what we're really trying to invite people into? Or are we trying to fill pews, and are we trying to fill Sunday school spaces? And that's one of the things we think about too. Sarah, you want to speak?
Yeah, you will. Yeah, well, you were reminding me too about, going to. You were reminding me about this, and I'd heard about it before with Apple, right? So that the understanding of how Apple sells its products is it begins with the why question. So why is it that people would want to purchase this? And then it moves out to the what question. So they are very cognizant of telling a story and giving a purpose before it gets to what exactly they're trying to sell you. And so there's a really effective strategy. And I do think while we're not here to make you sellers of something, I think we always as a church can be thinking about what are we learning from these other places. And so to begin with that, I think we talked about that as a compelling way for us to think about it in church too, is why is it that we want to share about this wonderful lecture series that we have going? What is it? What is the underlying why for that? And then to the lecture series or the Bible study or the mission opportunity, but to really lean into that. And as you're telling the story, really be thinking about that. The other thing I thought, as you were talking about, buying the brand as a kid, I don't know if you guys ever had this, but where I grew up, there were these constant challenges between Coke and Pepsi, and you would have a taste challenge and see if you could taste, a blind taste challenge, taste the difference between a Coke and a Pepsi. And what I always got out of that was like whether or not you were this kind of soda person or this kind of soda person, right? So they're trying to get you to buy into that. It's the brand and the identity more than it is what it is they're doing. And so that was the other thing I was thinking about as you were talking about that, just taking on a brand identity. We really want to be getting to the more depth of why is it that we're doing what we're doing, and inviting you into this conversation.
Yeah, and if you were to look at any of these images, you could probably answer some of these questions, which will flip us to ones that we want to turn inward into our church story. And you could probably figure out what story was being told, who is the presumed audience. You could think about what would make this story compelling for you to buy into that brand. You could think about what might make this suspicious. I particularly think of this Jeep ad there with Bruce Springsteen, which got a lot of criticism at the Super Bowl, especially because it was branding in a particular way and even used religious symbols as a way to sell a product. You can even look at the iPhone. I mean, clearly when you think of iPhone, you might not think of a white cowboy. But they are clearly trying to say, hey, look, relax. It's iPhone. You can trust us with this whatever. And so there's a way they're trying to communicate that this story includes you too. So there is that expansive witness, using our language. We might even say it's a bait and switch though for this purpose. Right, yeah. But then you could even say, are these brands noticed at all? Which leads us to these questions here, is that when it comes to the church, when you start to think about this kind of stuff of digital storying, when you think about your own faith community's presence online with online platforms, whether it's Facebook or Twitter or Instagram or your website or whatever, the question you want to ask is, what story is being told on those platforms? who would be the presumed audience? If you were to scroll through any of your postings of late, who's the presumed audience? Is it an internal audience, as in the folks that already know you, or is it user friendly, and is it expansive to those who maybe just be stumbling along the way? What would make your story and your community compelling? Would others be inspired to share the things that you're posting? Because that's what creates traffic. That's what creates a sense of energy and movement that you're a part of something. What would make you suspicious? I think that that's important to think about as well. I mean, we're always a confessional people, right? Is there stuff about what we're posting that maybe is not true to who we are, or may look like we're trying to sell something? And the last one is really important. Would you be noticed at all? Are you present on any of these platforms in a way that it is generating any traffic? When was the last time you did post? Because if you're not constantly sharing your story, eventually in these digital spaces, you fade away. If you're not active on these platforms, the algorithms go in such a way that you won't see things. So that's a question. If you're not present on these platforms, it's basically like taking your phone number out of a phone book 30 years ago. Nobody knows you even exist.
Yeah, it's interesting to move this to a metaphor that, and I'll name drop him. Doug Wattis is our partner in our communications person at Splashmore Press, and he's wonderful. And I was talking with him about this too, to get some of his wisdom. And one of the metaphors he kept coming back to was a party. And so, you know, in that last point you brought up, Greg, right, about whether, you know, how often you've been posting, or whether you've been, you know, when and how. One of the big things he emphasizes a lot is pacing. And so, you know, the question of when you walk into a party, right, if you take this metaphor, when you walk into a party, and do you walk up to the first person that you see and just share your whole life story? You don't, generally. Depending on what party you're walking into, generally you don't.
Won't anymore.
yeah, that's right. Life lesson. So you don't walk in and share your whole life story with the first person you see. You walk in and you know, like, you can kind of gauge your own presence in that space and the presence of the other people in that space. And you begin maybe with just chit chat and simple conversations. As the night goes on, maybe at some point you are ending up talking with somebody about something that's deeper, that's a more engaged conversation. The other piece of it is that you realize that when you're at a party, you have a different conversation with the different people that you're there with, so that you're there to see. You're not having the exact same conversation over and over and over and over again. If so, maybe not a party to go to again. You're having a different conversation with different people, because we all engage in different ways, including the person who is, you know, on this end of it, right? So I thought this was a really helpful metaphor in thinking about pacing. How often do you post? What do you post? Sometimes is that, you know, something, it is about the worship service that's coming up, and, you know, what people can expect. And then the next one might be, you know, oh, here's a picture from, you know, 1954. Can anybody recognize anybody there? And see if you can just generate some traffic. Or is it a you know, a testimony or a kind of a witness story of something that happened with a mission team, or with in a Bible study. You know, there's different ways to approach and different pacings on how you do that. And the reality is, in church, we're engaging on different levels with different things all the time. So we can really do that and have a consistent voice that are engaging in those different kinds of conversations over time. So just like as you're thinking about this as a metaphor, hopefully this is as helpful for you as it was for me.
I love that. And I mostly love it, like you said, Sarah, is it's also really good party advice for us to be thinking about how we posture ourselves at these social gatherings.
We have to remember, because we haven't gone to parties in a year and a half, so.
That's right. And, you know, Presbyterians attend some crazy parties, right?
Right.
But I think the one thing that we're also to use the metaphor is that you can think about when it comes to your presence at a party as well, the wallflowers or those who dominate the conversation. You can also overpost. And that's one of the things that we have to be careful about, is thinking about like what kind of volume are we putting out there, because if someone's just dominating the conversation at a party, that can be kind of intimidating, and that can potentially not be as expansive for your witness as well. But Sarah, when you shared this metaphor with me, it just blew my mind. So thank Doug for
I will. I thank him.
It's really,
I thank him
really
often.
So I just put a link in the chat for the rest of for you all. This is a document that Sarah and I developed over the past couple of weeks that our hope would be helpful for you as a ministry team or as an individual to kind of use in your conversations. Again, one of the number one things I would encourage you is to find ways to tell your stories not in isolation. Because quickly you can then only be telling stories that speak maybe even to just you, and you will not hear what's helpful from other points of view, other perspectives. And so even if it's just one other person that can help you tell stories, that can help you think about what kind of postings you can put out there, that would be great. But maybe use this as an exercise with your session or with some sort of communications team or with that individual. Some folks are privileged enough to have a staffer to do that. We do this at the presbytery level. I work with Betsy Moyes, and the two of us are consistently talking through what kind of stories we want to share, even as we're hearing from our executive staff and Ruth and Kevin and Sarah Colwell. We're talking about what kind of stories go out there, but we're doing it as a team. So we're going to give you a quick kind of image that's and at least some guiding questions that are pretty helpful when we think about how we tell stories digitally. The first thing is we want to start with, what is the story? What is a story you believe in and want to tell, is the way we say it. We don't want to start with the medium. We don't want to start with saying, hey, we need to get on TikTok. We want to start with story. Who are we? What is the narrative that we want to seek to convey? And why do we want to share that story? This why question is really important, because sometimes we're trying to keep up with the media, and we want to be out in the forefront of sharing important information. And then you can easily be chasing, as if your job on social media is to be like a journalist and to make the breaking news. But the reality is, as a church and even as a presbytery, we kind of got made aware of that several years ago when we realized we can't post all of these statements and everything all the time. You just literally can't keep up. So then we had to pull back and say, well, what is our call? And what is the story that we're called to? And then when these things come up, why do we want to post X, Y, and Z? So that's really important. It also affects when you share it, how often you share it. And as Sarah already mentions, the pace setting is very, very important. We'll go to a who as well. Who do you want to hear this story? And that impacts the design. That's kind of speaking to Cynthia's question earlier about images and whatnot. It depends on who you want to engage in this narrative. Working with teenagers will be very different than working with senior adults. Most teenagers are going to be on probably on TikTok or Snapchat these days, whereas a lot of senior adults are using Facebook in new ways. The reality is, it has been clear during the pandemic that all people are using digital spaces in some way, but who you want to hear that story will impact everything else. So we're still not even on the platform piece. Sarah, you're going to say something about that?
Yeah, well, no, I was just going to, the other who that I think is important for us to consider is, are you talking to your congregation? I think we just said earlier, but are you talking to your congregation, or are you talking to the larger community? So, if you're talking to your congregation, there's referential things that you can, hymn texts, Bible texts, stories, pictures from this, that, or the other. So and it's okay to do that sometimes, right? You're talking to your congregation in one way, but you're talking to the community. You can't use you use broader references, you use different ways of telling the story if you're talking to the broader community, so that they have a space to enter into a conversation that is already happening to some degree, or into the conversation in their own way, and knowing that that story then changes to a certain extent, right, as new people enter it. But I just wanted to lift that up as another kind of the who's, right? Is it internal or external?
Yes, and that real, I mean, the language matters. I mean, I've spent a lot of time going through our church's Facebook pages, Twitter accounts, Instagram over the years, just seeing what our folks are up to. And I mean, to be honest, and it happens for us as a presbytery a lot too, there's a lot of insider speak on our social media digital platforms. If that's all we're using our platforms for, is for those who are already engaged with our community, that's your who. But if you're a congregation that wants to reach a particular demographic, you really need to do some, like Sarah's mentioning, some really intentional discernment about what kind of language are you using? What kind of stories are we putting out there? Are these ones that are just familiar narratives to folks that are already connected to the community, or are these ones that invite or expand our witness? So that's really important, which does lead to another who. The who is kind of like twice over, is who do you want to join in sharing and adding to this story? Is it an open invitational story or closed consumed narrative? And the reason why we wanted to drop that there is because social media is just that. It's social networking. It's not designed to be a bulletin board that you see in your church narthex, and you're just like, oh, look, that happened. Storytelling on these digital platforms are supposed to be connectional. It's supposed to invite some sort of participation and sharing and engagement. And so really want to think through not only the why and all that kind of stuff, and the who, about who you want to hear this story, but who do you want to share it? And is it shareable? Is what you're posting something that others would stumble on and say, I want other people to hear about this narrative? And that's one of the questions I think is really, really important, which, Sarah, I mean, that's reminding me of the party metaphor.
Right.
Think about how many times somebody's telling a good story. Sarah, you gotta come over. You gotta
Yeah,
hear
that's
it.
right. That's right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Or then you if you're like me, try and take the story and tell it, and then it's not the same. But yes, you want to invite people into it. And I think
And preachers do that all the time.
Oh yeah. Ruth had a good comment too on the chat about, these guidelines also can be applied to how we're engaging, how we're coming together in congregational meetings. The ways that we're telling our own story, that's that internal telling, right? Because we also have to equip ourselves in telling our own story, like all of us, to then be able to face outward and do that in a consistent way too. So it helps us in our internal storying and in that external. Thank you.
And that leads to the last one, is a how. How might this story be accessed? What platforms would be beneficial? Again, this is the last question. So often folks get so anxious about digital storying platforms because they start here at the how instead of at the story beginning. And we get in this frenzy about trying to use all social media platforms, and hear us loud and clear. Not every community is called to use every digital platform. I have a confession. I don't have a TikTok account. So I may have just lost significant cool points with anyone on this call, or some of you may say, neither do I. The presbytery doesn't have a TikTok account yet. We may someday, we don't know. We're constantly thinking through our story and our why, and that shapes what platforms we do use. So my hope is that as we're talking through this, that you could breathe a little easy and recognize that it's not, the goal is not to be on every digital platform, but it's to use platforms that serve the purposes of the who, the why, and ultimately our narrative as people on this pilgrim road called discipleship. And so what does that look like? So just breathe easy there. So this is the little narrative here, or the little image here that you have of concentric circles. And we start with the story, and it builds out and out as we ask these important questions of, why do we want to tell this story? Who do we want to hear this story? Who do we want to share this story? And how will we get this story out? Or if you flip it over this way, to the arrows going out. That way you can start thinking about how the story is building outwards this way. It's almost like that megaphone, and it's kind of moving that direction. If you start moving from the how in a little bit, you're quickly using the product or the platform to drive your narrative versus the narrative driving who you are and what you want to be about. And we see this so often in our churches and in our ministries that can so quickly lose the core of who they are because they're trying to keep pace with the trends versus staying true to who they are and using one or two platforms and using them very, very well for the sake of their community. And then also the who, when you get stuck in the middle here, they might even help you understand other hows, or they might help you go the other direction and learn more about your narrative before you even go to that platform.
Yeah, that makes me think to a certain degree, it's a little bit of like that you do you know, like do what you do well, find those places where you do that well, and at least initiate there, right? Or at least begin there to like really play around with how you're telling your story there. And then that could blossom out. Like we always want to be able to engage at different places and different audiences, but really begin with that, you know, what do we know how to do and how to do that well? Again, this is not about us putting more work on you. This is about trying to figure out how to do the things you're doing, you know, even better than you're already doing them.
And we're intentional when we started this conversation as we kind of around the corner with a couple quotes towards the end, but we're intentional of calling this a means of grace. We've said for a long time is that these digital platforms can be sacramental when we use them for that, when we use them as a means of grace, welcome, and witness, and expansive in all of those spaces. It's easy for us to say, well, look at how bad social media and all these places are, fill in the blank. And that's been said about any place where people gather throughout history. Sure, there are some places where it may not be best for folks to gather. It might not be healthy or safe or whatever, aside from digital platforms. But there are also places some folks might not like a bar, might not like a pub. There may be reasons why they can't go into a bar or a pub. But there are plenty of people that go into those various spaces and share some amazing stories about what God is doing among the people in that local brewery or whatever. So, but not all people are called there. It's the same thing with technology. It's the same thing with digital spaces. Not everybody's called to use all platforms, but I think that the church is called to engage in some way, shape, or form all of these spaces, broadly speaking, as a means of grace, welcome, and witness, to share the good news wherever we can, whether that's the local good news in our church or in our presbytery or in our neighborhood, using those platforms for goodness. That's the redemptive work that we're called to. Which leads to this quote from someone you may be familiar with, learning from someone outside the church. Simon Sinek wrote a great book, Start With Your Why. And he said this, he said, it is not a company or an organization that decides what its symbols mean. It is the group outside the megaphone in the chaotic marketplace who decide. If based on the things they see and hear, the outsiders can clearly and consistently report what an organization believes, then and only then can a symbol start to take meaning. It is the truest test of how effective a megaphone has been produced when clarity is able to filter all the way through the organization and come to life in everything that comes out of it. Now, we could nuance this like crazy, but the reality is that what people are hearing, perception and all that kind of stuff really does tell the truth of our story. And we need to do an intentional job or work of thinking, how are people hearing the narrative of our ministry that we've worked on, that we felt called to, that we want people to be a part of, whether it's a ministry initiative or the regular rhythms of our faith community. So I think Simon Sinek's words here are really helpful.
Yeah, and the last part about, you know, the when clarity is able to filter all the way through the organization and come to life and everything that comes out of it. I mean, think about that in the context of ministry, you know, that we are bringing that we might even be bearers of a story that brings to life a new witness to the gospel, or a new way, a new means of grace, or a new avenue of witness, that there is life that can come out that we might not even expect, a clarity that comes out from the stories we tell on the other side of that megaphone, on the other side of that witness. That's really a wonderful thing to imagine, as we're telling our stories, what is the life that this takes on in the broader community?
Which leads us to that segue. This is the final question before we open it up for any questions in the chat or any final reflections from anyone else. Is you could take that quote, and if you substituted the word company or organization for church, faith, community, or ministry, what are some implications for digital and sacred storytelling? And then you can even consider both the ways this reference would parallel the call of the church and the ways this reference may even depart from what it means to be the church. One of the things I can think of right away is we do have to be careful that the marketplace drives too much of our story, because then all of a sudden we actually don't have a uniqueness to our identity and our sense of call and our core confessional convictions. That's one of the things to keep in mind. But there's a lot. So Sarah, I don't know if you have any other final comments you want to add to that before we open it up to the chat.
No, I'm really eager to know if there's anybody else. I mean, we've had a couple of really good comments and questions, and I'm really eager to know, because I feel like a lot of this can be, as I would watch something like this, it is a big idea, but I'd love to know how this is hitting people and the questions that you have specific to, to where you are and what questions you have about storytelling.
Right. So feel free to drop any questions or comments in the chat, and we could throw there. I'm also going to, while we're doing this, I'm also going to invite our state clerk, Kevin Porter, to come back on screen, because he's going to close us in prayer in a moment. And if he wants to offer any final thoughts too, that'd be helpful. I do know that as we're waiting, if anyone has any comments, the one thing I would just leave you with, to at least be reminded, is one, what is most important in all of this is to do this work in community. Do it in a sense of a team as you're learning what stories are out there. Find ways to create rhythm and movement. But really think about why you're seeking to tell that story more so than the how. So don't get lost in the platform. Make sure you keep the why and the who of your narrative and storytelling at the center. Here's a question: will these slides be available to us after the webinar today? Absolutely. Yep. We're going to make these available. We'll be putting all this stuff online. And there's that handout. It is already in the link in the chat.
And then there's Lori asked, are there resources for beginning books or podcasts to start the conversation? The handout that we put together has some resources and some thoughts for, some really simple and easily accessible digital tools for digital storytelling. Greg, do you have books? Do you have any books or podcasts that you'd recommend?
We can continue to create a list. The one that I mentioned before and it's on the it was on that first slide, which we can post out there, is that Church and New Media. That book was really helpful. Back to the Money, Media, Mission conversation. If you remember, Keith Anderson is a pastor up in Upper Dublin. He wrote a book called Digital Cathedrals. Now, a lot of this stuff is from pre-pandemic, so a lot of things have changed. And so we're going to be doing some digging on some other resources to look into. But if you have some that you would like to share with us, let us know. But we'll be sure to follow up this conversation with some other resources that we'll try to glean.
And I would say, in terms of story, podcasts or ideas like that, I actually listen to it. There's so many podcasts now that are based on that long form storytelling. Like your ones that are really familiar, like Moth and This American Life. But there's any of those, like sometimes I go to those to think about, they work very hard at telling a consistent story or telling stories in short form in different ways. And so even just hearing how others are working on that, and that's all, obviously that's audio, but that does help you get, I think the other thing that, that we're trying to work on is just a consistency in our storytelling, a consistency, even if it's from one story, even if it's within one story, a consistency of to the very basics, like typeface, colors that come through, content, how that all comes together to make the whole story. And then is there a consistency of voice? And so, it's interesting to kind of pick that up from outside folks who really do the work of storytelling. all the time. So yeah, I think another list of more resources as we're learning from them, it's great. Let's see.
There's, and I think
Great.
to your point, Sarah, is for sure. I mean, NPR does these things called StoryCorps, which have
Right.
been really powerful, short little anecdotes about what's happening, and they're like 3 or 4 minutes.
Right.
And I think part of that too is, and here's a caution: it's always a trendy for churches to start amping up their storytelling right around stewardship season, right? and that's so, like, when it comes to like what makes you suspicious, I would say that if you only are telling stories in your congregation or on your social media platforms right around the time when you're going to drop an ask, then your narratives are going to create that Pavlov's dog feeling that the only time folks are telling stories is when they want money. And so that's what your community is about. But if you tell stories throughout the year, if you steward those stories all the time, then your narratives become more authentic and genuine. And then you can drop asks without it coming across as suspicious. So I think StoryCorps does a good job with that. And that's one of the things we've tried to do as a presbytery as well, is to drop these little anecdotes as much as we can.
And then I see also a question: if there's anyone who wants to converse about the who, what, or how. So Lori Kaczynski asks, welcomes that conversation. And then I would say the other resource that we haven't named specifically here, but the CRC and the Presbytery is also, if talking about doing this in community, we've got folks that would love to talk to you about, hear your story, love to talk to you about that. And help you think about ways to share some of the things that you're doing. So that, just another one that's right available here.
And that's what the last thing we can say, then we'll turn it over to Kevin, is the annual reports for our grant recipients is a place where we encourage folks to do some storytelling work. And again, like Sarah was saying, like, we are willing to help you with that. It's not, hey, submit your story to us so that we can grade it like a book report when you're in elementary school. It's submit your story so we can see the goodness that you're about. Or if you need some help telling the story of your ministry, reach out to us, and we're more than happy to help you do that.
Wow. Well, I just want to echo what Ruth put on the screen. Thank you, Greg, Sarah, and back to the commission that is doing this great work as a technology Luddite, which is a running joke in the presbytery. It is so good to know of different ways that we can magnify the loving story that Ashley lifted up in prayer, God's love story with humanity and all creation, and also to validate those that have the gift set of facility with all these forms of media, that is a ministry. That's a ministry gift, and to honor that. So with that, as we prepare to leave this circle and go into other circles to share the story and invite others to the party, let us pray. Loving and gracious God, we do give thanks for the amazing love story that you have put into our hearts and minds and lives for us to share and to tell. Lord, we give thanks for the fact that we walk in the middle of a story that has been for generations and is as long as you would deem to have life on this earth. And Lord, we also give thanks that each of us has a story to tell and the gifts with which to do it. Lord, help us to do so in a way that honors you and honors every other person as someone stewarding a story, that we could do it in a way that respects them and credits you as the author and finisher of our faith. So continue to work in and amongst us to weave our stories together, that we would magnify the story of the living and forgiving Christ that we all serve, and in whose name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Kevin.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Go in
Thank
peace.
you all. Bye-bye.